Bruchim haboim. Welcome everyone. We're about to begin Be'ezras Hashem together on Daf Chof Hey Amud Aleph, the second line from the top. The Gemara continues to discuss about karpef. Karpef is an enclosed area. Generally, it's for non-residential purposes, like storing wood, and therefore only up until base saw 5,000 square amos can a person metalta within that area. However, it's beyond 2 saw, then he can no longer metaltil more than daled amos like a karmelis. However, if a person has a karpef that is for residential purposes, then there's no limitation to the area that it encloses. Says the Gemara, karpef yoiser mi beis sasayim shaloi hukaf ledira. If you have a karpef for non-residential purposes, the Gemara wants to understand, is there a way to then make it so that even though it's beyond 2 saw, that you can go ahead and reduce it to then enable carrying it within it. Says the Gemara, ubo lema'atoy. He wants to then minimize the size of these walls. Mi'atu bi'ilonois lehavimut. If he tries to do so by planting trees, then that's not going to make a mute. It will not reduce the area of the karpef, because after all, a classical karpef has planted trees in it. Says the Gemara, but bona boy amud gavoya asara v'roichav arbo have a mute. But if he builds a pillar that has the dimensions of 10 tfachim high and 4 tfachim wide, then that will, yes, reduce the size of the karpef. And therefore, if it will then be 2 saw or less, then you go ahead and freely carry within it. Pachos mi gimel loy have a mute. But if it's less than gimel as the width, then it's not a mute. Mi gimel v'adalit. However, between gimel and 4 tfachim, there's a machlokes. Rabba Omar have a mute. Rava Omar loy have a mute. Rabba says that even though it's between 3 and 4, that's enough to make a mute. It has still significance. Whereas Rava says not. Explains the Gemara, Rabba Omar have a mute, the hanafik limitaras lavud. Why is between 3 and 4 considered to be significant enough to make a mute, to make a reduction in the size of the area of the karpef? Is because it no longer is lavud. Lavud is only up until 3 tvachim. So beyond 3 tvachim is already significant. Whereas Rav Amar loy have a mute. Kivin loy have a makom dalid loy chashiv. So long as not dalid, it's still not yet chashuv. Granted, it's no longer lavud, but it's not chashuv enough to make a mute. And therefore, that's the machlokes between Rabba and Rava. Harchik. Here we're talking not being memayed the area of the karpef from beyond 2 saw to 2 saw or less. Now we're discussing that we know if you have a wall that is for non-residential purposes, again, you're limited to 2 saw. However, if it's going to be a wall that is made for residential purposes, that's the area of the karpef, then you can go beyond, we said, 2 saw. So here the Gemara is going to explain when is it possible to make a wall that will then be a new wall for residential purposes. Says the Gemara, Hirchik min hakoisel arbo v'osa mechitza. If you distant from the wall, the pre-existing wall that surrounds the karpef, and we're talking about again beyond 2 saw, and you go a little bit within, how much? It says over here, if it's arbo tfachim, then it's enough when you make that mechitza to then be considered that the new mechitza that is within, that is inside of that older mechitza, can now encircle an area greater than 2 saw, but for residential purposes. Hoyel, it's effective. Pachos migimel, but if it's less than 3 tfachim, then loy hoyel is not going to be effective. Migimel v'adal, now we have a machlekes. Rabba Omar hoyel, Rav Omar eino oil. Rabba says it's going to be effective when it's going to be 3 to 4 tfachim away from the outer wall, whereas Rava says not. Now explains the Gemara, Rabba Omar Hoyil Deha Nafik Le Mitaras Lavud. Why is it going to be effective? Because since 3 Tvachim is no longer Lavud, so it's no longer going to be connected, so to speak, closed to the outer wall, whereby you're going to have a new mechitza, and therefore it's going to be valid to then make a now mechitza around the karpef for residential purposes. So therefore now, though it's beyond 2 saw, you can go ahead and carry, because it's a new wall for residential purpose. Rav Amar Eino Moyel Kivin the Loy Have Makom Dalid Loy Choshiv. Because Rava says, so long as you don't have a makom that's going to be dalid al dalid tvachim, it doesn't have chashivus, and therefore it's not going to then make a valid wall to then surround the karpef for a new purpose called a residential area. Rav Simi Masni Lekula. Rav Simi, he teaches both machlekes that we just had above between Rabba and Rava, Lekula. Explains Rashi, take a look at Rashi, parallel to where we're reading. Masni lekula. Lahach plukta deleil. This machlokes above. V'omar de bishloisha de nafik le mitaras lavud kulhu moidu de amud have miut. Umechitza have mechitza ledir v'lo kemoisif. In both machlokes, whether it's the machlokes in regard to reducing the area by making so a amud that is going to be an area that's going to be to minimize the area with making it an amud, a pillar, or as well as the machlokes of making then a new mechitza, so that's now a residential area. In both cases, says Rashi, bepachas mishloisha peligi. In other words, everybody agrees when it's 3 or above tfachim, it's going to be either minimizing or, in both cases, or making a new mechitza. When is there going to be a machlokes, says Rashi, only if it's going to be less than 3 tfachim. Says the Gemara weiter, continuing its discussion in regards to then minimizing the space of the karpef. If you have, again, a karpef beyond 2 saw, and you want to reduce that space, says the Gemara, tach boitit. If you put on the wall enough mud, enough clay, that it will stand on its own, that means to say that it's thick enough to be a wall on its own, have a mute that will be then reducing the area of this karpef. But if there's not enough mud and not enough teeth on this wall to then stay on its own, there's a machlokes. Rab Omar have a mute. Rav Omar lo have a mute. Rabba says that it's still going to be considered to be significant to make a mute, to then minimize the size, the area of this karpef. Whereas Rabba argues, says the Gemara, Rabba Omar have a mute hashta mihakoi, because we look at right now, and currently it does stand. So therefore it's going to be a valid minimizing of the karpef. Rav Omar lo have a mute, kivan de lo yochel lemekam b'fnei atzmo lo klumu. Since it doesn't have the ability to then remain, it doesn't have significance, and therefore it will not be able to then minimize the karpef. What about in regards to then going back to the discussion of making a new wall so that it will be for residential purposes, even though the area is beyond 2 saw? Hirchik min hatel arba v'asa mechitza. If you go ahead and distance from the tail, here we have a mound of dirt, and if you distance from that mound 4 tfachim, and you make the mechitza, so then that's going to be valid. Hoyil, it's effective to then enclose the area to be now a new wall. Instead of the mound being, let's say, a wall, you're going to then make a wall within 4 tvachim of that. You're going to be 4 tvachim away from that mound. It's a new mechitza, and it's effective. Pachos migimel oy al svas hatel, either less than 3 tvachim, or on the edge of the mound. Rav Chizda, Rav Hamnuna, it's a machlokes. Chad amar hoyil, v'chad amar lo hil. One says that it's going to be effective, while the other one argues. Tistayim de Rav Chizda Omar Hoyle. Let us conclude that it's Rav Chisda that it says that it's effective even though it's less than 3 tfachim or it's on the edge of the tail. The Itmar, ha'oisa mechitza al gabe mechitza, first to make the mechitza on top of another mechitza. Omar Rav Chisda b'Shabbos Hoyle, b'nichse ager lo'kana. Rav Chisda says, by Shabbos, it will be effective, even though it's a mechitza on top of another mechitza. So to over here, a mechitza on the edge of the tail, or in this case, within 3 tfachim, will be effective. However, when it comes to such a mechitza, for nichse hager, if a ger die without children, so there's no need to yoresh him. So let's say a person then took and he had a mechitza that was now on top of another pre-existing mechitza with a property where the ger's nechasim were. So in a normal situation, if you build a fence around the property, so then you can make a kinyan of that property. However, says Rav Chisda, if you're going to make a mechitza al gabi mechitza, a mechitza on top of a mechitza, that's not going to be effective to be koine the nechasim of the ger. Rav Sheshes Omar af b'Shabbos nami l'hoyel. Rav Sheshes argues on Rav Chisda and says even on Shabbos, such a mechitza that's a mechitza al gabe mechitza, one on top of the other, will not be effective for Shabbos to enable a person to then minimize the size, not the size, but rather be a new wall, a new fence for the karpeh for residential purposes. Tistayim, now we conclude that it's indeed Rav Chisda that is the one who holds that it would be effective if it's less than 3 tfachim on the edge of the tail to make a good mechitza. Says the Gemara weiter, Rav Chisda umoideli Rav Sheshes. However, Rav Sheshes would be agreeing with me she'im osa mechitza al hatel shahoyel, that if you would make a mechitza on top of the tail, on top of the mound, then that would be effective. Why? My taima hoyel ubi avir mechitza is ha'elyones hudar. Since if a person he's going to be using then the mechitza that are on top of the tail, since he's on top over there. And therefore, that's what's going to be the mechitzas that are going to be effective. So even Rav Sheshes would agree with that because those are what's surrounding him. Not the ones below, but the ones that are on top where he lives. Boy Rabbi Bar Chana. Rabbi Bar Chana asked the following question. Nivleu mechitzas hatachtoinos. You have mechitzos. And those mechitzos that are tachtoinos, then subsequently go into the ground. That means that they are sunken. V'ha'elyonos kayamis. But the elyonos, they now still exist. So what's the way that we look at this? In other words, do we say that the new mechitzos, the elyonos, are now effective because those are the ones that are giving then the mechitzos? Or we say no, they are just in place of the old mechitzas that were already there. Only the old ones got sunken. So now the new ones are just simply there in their replacement, but they're not going to be effective. Lemai, ask the Gemara, what are we asking this question about? In regards to then making a fence and saying whether you can go koine the nechasim of the ger. Hainu Yirmiyahu biro. This is that statement of Rabbi Yirmiyahu Biro, the Omar Yirmiyahu Biro, Omar Rav Yehuda. Haiman deshada lifta apilo, one who threw a lefet, a radish, a turnip inside of a crack of the ground, which would be then going ahead and planting it. The Ara the Ger, where the Ger lived, the Osa Yisro Achrino, Rofak Bapurta, comes along another Bar Yisrael, and he digs a little bit. Basra Kani Kama Loikani. The second one who dug a little bit, he is Kaineh, the first one not. Because the first one, he didn't do any active thing. All he did is threw the turnip. The turnip itself may take seed, and it could even take seed before the second one comes along and digs. But if it does, it's doing so mimela, not with the action of the one who threw the turnip. Whereas the second one who comes along and digs into the ground, he's doing an act that will then give him a chazaka to be koine, the nechasim of the ger. My time, the Gemara explains, the time that the first one threw the turnip, he did not then make better the ground. He didn't improve it. In other words, he didn't really do anything to actually cause it with an active way of planting. Only afterwards, subsequently, then the ground became improved by this turnip, because it took time to then take seed. Whereas in regards to the Indian of Shabbos, so then it will be a mechitza for Shabbos. V'tanyo, and it states in the Brisa, called mechitza nase b'Shabbos bein b'shogi bein b'mezid shema mechitza. So we have from here this Brisa telling us that a mechitza that is made on Shabbos is, yes, a good mechitza. So therefore we can conclude that indeed the question over here was a mechitza that was tachtoin and sunk into the ground. Does the mechitza elyoina become effective for the Shabbos? So we see over here that indeed, even though on Shabbos it will be then a mechitza, it's valid. The Gemara asks, Lav itmar Allah, but did not we teach on this statement that a mechitza that's made on Shabbos is valid? Only midiraisa as to be machmir do we say it's going to be a good mechitza. For if a person were to throw and make a transferring of an object from one rishus harabim, into then the walled area, the rishus hayachid, then he's going to be chayiv. But midirabanan, they didn't permit being metaltel an object with such a mechitza. So therefore, how can you say it's a valid mechitza in regards to then making it for residential purposes to then close the karpif? Answers the Gemara, Ki itmar de Rav Nachman amazid itmar. That which Rav Nachman stated, that it's only going to be a mechitza for lizruk, but not letiltul, he's talking about b'mezid is not going to be letiltul. But over here, it wasn't the mezid. Here, the bottom wall then sunk, leaving the second wall effective. Says the Gemara with the following Maisa, there was a woman who made a mechitza on top of another mechitza of the nechasim of a ger. In other words, she wanted then to be koine from the ger who then just died by making this mechitza on top of another mechitza, by making what she thought was a chazaka. Osahu gavra, a person came, rofak bapurta, and he dug a little bit, making a chazaka into the ground. Also, the coming to Rav Nachman, ukme biyode. He came before Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman then established the property to be now in the hands of the second person who made the digging. Also, ihi v'kotzav kamei. This woman came and she started screaming in front of Rav Nachman. O malo, Rav Nachman said to her, Mai ave loch, deloy machzakt, kidemachzake inshi, you didn't do a chazaka, and therefore you weren't then zoiche in the nechasim of the ger.